This week, we talk with Shannon Lietz from Intuit. In the news segment, a mode line goes reverse shell, a post message raises extension hell, another side channel for show and tell, DevSecOps, and more as well. Stay tuned for Application Security Weekly.
This is a Security Weekly production. Signal Sciences secures the most important web applications, APIs, and microservices of the world's leading companies, protecting over 7,500 applications and 150 billion production requests per week. Signal Sciences Next-Gen WAF and RASP help companies increase security and maintain site reliability without sacrificing velocity, all at the lowest total cost of ownership. Signal Sciences patented technology protects any application against any attack, with integrations into any DevOps toolchain. Signal Sciences, demand more from your WAF. Learn more at signalsciences.com/PSW.
Welcome to Application Security Weekly. This is episode 65, recorded June 17th, 2019. I'm your host, Mike Shema, and I'm here with John Kinsella.
Hey, Mike.
Hey, John. You are now, I think, our traveling co-host. So never in the same place week to week.
I missed you guys last week. I was in London, but yeah, I'm in India this week, so good to be here as usual.
Glad to have you here. So, register for our upcoming webcasts with Domain Tools, SaltStack, ISC Squared, and Viavi Solutions by going to securityweekly.com/webcasts. If you have missed any of our previously recorded webcasts, you can find our on-demand library at securityweekly.com/on-demand. Security Weekly is returning to Vegas this August for Black Hat and DEF CON. If you would like to request a briefing or sponsor an interview on site at Black Hat, please go to securityweekly.com/booking and submit your request. Shannon Lietz is an award-winning innovator with over 2 decades of experience pursuing advanced security defenses and next-generation security solutions. Ms. Lietz is currently the DevSecOps leader for Intuit, where she is responsible for setting and driving the company's security engineering strategy and cloud security support for product innovation. She is passionate about leading the charge for security transformation and change management in large environments, leveraging agile and rugged principles. Prior to joining Intuit, Ms. Lietz worked for several Fortune 500 companies, most notably Sony and ServiceNow, where she supported mission-critical teams engaged in advanced security programs. She has also had previous experience as a serial entrepreneur operating to solve some of the world's hard problems. Ms. Lietz holds a Bachelor's of Science degree in Biological Sciences from Mount St. Mary's College. She is an avid blogger and evangelist for all things DevSecOps, Hacker Girl, and rugged software. Hi, Shannon. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me here.
And unfortunately for all of our listeners and for Shannon, her voice is a little rough, but we have to give you extra thanks for powering through today. And to possibly set the stage and give your voice a moment to gather itself, I wanted to set this conversation up with the idea of threat modeling and DevSecOps. So threat modeling is a little bit of what are you trying to build, what could go wrong, what are you doing about it? And the fourth question is often, how well did you do? And if we take this from a broader DevSecOps mentality, thinking DevSecOps is a way we're trying to build software, we want to use DevSecOps principles to do it better. Let's skip to that last part, Shannon, and say, how do we know we're actually doing well in DevSecOps? Or, why should we, how can we tell that we're doing a good job?
Yeah, this is such a passion of mine. When you start looking at what we do from DevSecOps perspective and you're trying to mature everything that you're doing along the way, the last bit is really measurement. And from a measurement standpoint, I think that really becomes a critical problem for most companies because no one's really got great security measurement, as you can imagine. And so one of the things that we've been working on in the DevSecOps movement is how do you measure your success? Recently, I've been talking about securability as that measurement. And what I mean by that is really how do we understand the exploitability of our applications and whether or not attackers are actually doing something with those problems.
So that idea of securability is, it's something that you've been talking about recently, and it sounds like it's building up security. In other words, what are we doing more of, or what can a team do more of to improve their process? And it's still a little bit different from risk, I think, as well. Even though risk is often a similar metric when we talk about impact and likelihood. But what are some of the ways you look at this idea of securability and start to measure it, or what are the good inputs to that measurement?
Yeah, it's a great question. The inputs to securability are really about trying to measure your total exploits. So you actually have to test, you have to go through the process of enumerating your exploitable surface. And then when you're actually going through that process, you're putting together tests, you're putting together some level of understanding that exploitable surface. And the overall equation is really about how do we take what the security team is doing and really make it accessible by developers. And developers are thinking about how do I make my software resilient enough? But security folks are figuring out how are all the ways that it could break, and really giving a language around that is through measurement. The way that we're thinking about it is making it so that the developer side of this equation is all about resilience. So, and then the security contribution is really about making it so that you could have exploitability at its um, at its core. And so the idea is it's really about reversing the exploitability measure that we all work on so heavily in the security teams and giving it away to your developers. So the equation is really one minus exploitability as a percentage of the overall attack surface. And when you do that, what you find out is you place it into the 5 nines category. And so what we've been really working with is how do we get to the point where the 5 nines of security are finally being talked about by the people that are most important to this equation, which is our makers and our developers and the people who are actually trying to make resilient software.
And it sounds like, it's that idea of exploitability, that it's and being able to talk to developers from this perspective and having resilience in their systems is that this, this, I guess, is not quite mythical CI/CD pipeline, but the legendary CI/CD pipeline that we all point to where our tools and our developers work in, that perhaps scanners are doing a better job as being part of this, or scanners are a key part of being able to have this aspect of exploitability and testing. Is that true, or are there other angles or other approaches you also take in terms of measuring that exploitability?
Yeah, I think that having scanners in your CI/CD pipeline is one point of view. But most scanners are actually latent, no matter what they are so far in the security industry. We're actually talking about stuff that requires somebody to find a problem that then gets automated as part of sort of bulk scanning your application, bulk scanning a capability. And the problem with that is you're really not looking for things upstream. So when we talk about shift left, we're not actually talking about just putting your scanners into your CI/CD pipeline. We're talking about how do you find the weaknesses and how do you make sure that they're not coming through the pipeline at all. And so some of the ways that you have to think about it is how do my applications create victims? How do I have applications that are going to be resilient enough to protect the people who want to use those software applications so that they aren't becoming victimized by bad guys? And that really requires you to look upstream and figure out, oh, I have all of this threat modeling that's helping. But I've actually done something a little bit different in my past, which was we handed out a blank sheet of paper to the developers and said, all right, forget about threat modeling, forget about all of the things that you think you need to know to be able to do this. Tell me how to break into your application. And what was interesting was to give them 15 minutes. And they came back with all these things that were really, really serious issues. And what was interesting about it was they didn't have to do any threat modeling. They just literally said, here's all the decisions I made that put my application at risk. And so what we found out through that set of experiments was that we as security professionals were just making it a little bit too complicated for the developers to be able to talk to us. Instead of doing all this work to make it so it was accessible for the security professional, we said, just tell us how you're gonna like make your stuff more resilient. Where if you had time, would you add security back to your application? And what was interesting about that was unanimously they were like, well, here's a few key areas. Like as an example, it's really hard to do zoning and containment. And we don't necessarily have all the capabilities necessary to do things like spread our workloads across accounts and say in a cloud. And that could actually give them more security. But because they didn't really have that capability to do it with ease, it becomes sort of a non-pattern for them. And so I think that as you're kind of thinking about securability, it's really from the inception of when you're going to create something all the way through that pipeline that you actually have to figure out your measures, because exploitability starts at the time that somebody's actually creating software, that they're starting to really work through solving a customer's problem. And the customer's problem may actually create sort of not only a use case, but an abuse case.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And what it also there's a good subtext there in the sense that it's developers are by no means ignorant of security. In fact, they may be experts, like you were saying, on where the security or lack of security, where some improvements could be made for various reasons, whether it's lack of capabilities or just lack of time, or other types of constraints within their own apps. That sounds like that blank sheet of paper and say, how would you hack your own site? Sounds like a fantastic and pretty straightforward approach. I'm
Yeah,
curious,
and it's
yeah.
easy too.
Yes, exactly. And we were starting to talk a little bit at the end too about kind of containment and sandboxing. And I wonder too, as we talk about modern DevSecOps, either principles and or tools that are available to us or design patterns, what's been the role of containers or that type of either immutable systems or systems that get rolled out quickly and that can be updated quickly? Does that play into this aspect of securability, or is that just one of those additional practices that are part of resilience for that matter?
Yeah, containers are amazing, hands down. The orchestration software and all of those other things, well, that's where some of the things that I worry about happen, right? But when we start thinking about what are we giving a developer and how are we giving them the tools to be able to secure their workloads, containers really give them that immutability capability. And they go through this process of getting exploited, but really quickly being able to fix everything that they have in their application from the whole stack perspective. And I think that's really essential to being able to move faster than bad guys. So as you find stuff that is insecure, you can actually change everything about your application with ease. And that used to be a problem that was extremely difficult to do. If you found that your application had, as an example, perimeter problems, you weren't capable of doing anything to be able to fix that problem. You just kind of had to rely on everybody else. You had to have conversations with your network guy, your security folks, and you started to realize, like, as an application developer, it wasn't actually that successful as a model. But now, as developers are building a lot more of their software, and they're doing it from the whole stack perspective, that becomes something that they have the power to actually change. And so you can take a more holistic approach, one like the security hierarchy of needs, where an application developer has the ability to really figure out at that baseline core level, what are my zoning and containment privileges that I have to put in place for my application? So they can think about their security groups, or they can think about their actual firewalling capabilities in a different way with containers. And so I think that really we're moving in the right direction. We're putting more security capability to build resilient software stacks into the developers' hands. And I think that they have the partnership now that they need with a lot of security professionals that are moving over to DevSecOps. And specifically around when a DevSecOps is trying to measure and figure out how to make something that's exploitable come to life so that the developer actually understands that.
Absolutely. I'm curious too, John, I want to make sure we pull you into the conversation as well. Um,
It, that was sort of interesting the way Shannon just described that. So over the last few years, the way I think, Shannon, about um, developers getting to use containers, I agree with you. There's all these awesome things about them, but the way I've thought of it from my neck of the woods is, as you're giving the developers the ability to use those containers, you're actually increasing the responsibility of what they have to be aware of or be able to fix. Um, from that infosec point of view, they used to just be able to focus on their, let's say Java classes and work on their code, and now you're saying, hey, oh, by the way, everything in that container image is, since you're actually building it and creating the Docker files from what have you, you have some level of responsibility. But you're looking at that from a different angle, which seems interesting. Any thoughts about that? Those sort of the dichotomy between those two?
Yeah, it's interesting the way you're talking about it, because I used to have that perspective. And I used to believe that a developer should only really work on their code. And I am also somebody who develops code at night and weekends because it's fun. And I really like the way that containers work from the perspective of, I actually now have at my disposal what I know I need for security. And I also know that when I'm making a choice about, say, a library or something that I'm going to have to choose to be able to make my application work, that there's other things I might be able to do to mitigate using containers, using the technology around those open source libraries that I might be taking a risk on. And so I don't think that asking a developer to just build one little tiny part of the application is actually the most suitable thing. But I do think that there's a lot of opportunity for security professionals to now really try to understand how development works, what choices are made, how to actually provide capabilities that will make things more secure. There's lots of companies that have done this for years and years. And one of the things that I've always been really interested in is when Digital went through their process of trying to create a library that did output validation. I thought that they did a really unique job that made it so that developers could make their code a little bit more resilient. And so from my perspective, to your point, like, we used to think one way, but I do think we have to shift as a security community. And I think we have to start taking that vantage point of really working through what it's going to mean to provide security capability back to folks that need it. We're now a service provider, not necessarily just a governance mechanism in companies.
That seems to tie into as well, I think, a little bit when you're starting to talk about vendors, is that I'm curious from your perspective, either Shannon or John, if you've seen, like, do we have actually a commoditization within the DevSecOps tool chain? It's a word that's easily bandied about. People easily claim they do DevSecOps or follow some DevSecOps principles. What about the vendor side of things? Do we actually have tools, in addition, aside from containers, because it sounds like that's really strong? Do we have tools that are helpful at the moment, or are there better ways that vendors can position their tools to be more consumable by DevSecOps teams?
John, do you want to take that first?
I'll give your voice a rest. I mean, I think, yeah, right. It's a lot of what really comes down to is if can you automate it? Smiling there as you talk through that, Mike, because it's. I was at doing a CISO roundtable last week, and that saying that standard point of DevSecOps or DevOps, either one, it doesn't come in a box, right? It's something you have to sort of build into your company and really sort of get people's buy-in and support, and it becomes part of what the overall process is. But at the same time, I think the tools you're going to use to allow you to get to that point where you've got that modern capability, you have to have one way or another the ability to automate, preferably through an open API. worst case through like some set of plugins. But that's sort of the way I think of it is, it's how do you take all, I mean, it really comes down to how do you automate those security bits? It's a large portion of what that is. So if you're able to, leverage either a framework or a library or an API set to be able to actually get to that point, I think that makes it a lot easier because everyone's environment is always different. I mean, let's play buzzword bingo with how many different CI/CD platforms are out there, right? Jenkins, Bamboo, Circle CI. The guys at Pivotal are always telling me about theirs, and I can never remember it. But there's all these tools, GitLab, and I'm just talking about the builders themselves. You start adding in all these different components, it becomes a. If you've ever seen a vendor chart of some of this specific space, you get more icons and more vendor logos, and you know what to do with very quickly. So you have to have some ability to work with that.
Yeah, underlying all of this, John, I totally agree with you. When we first got started with DevSecOps, there really weren't any products out there that you could easily use. So as an example, some of the scanners, they didn't come with very successful REST APIs. So it was hard to pull out the information from them, get them to do scans to produce the outcome of the CI/CD process. I think they're getting better, but APIs are starting to become not good enough. And so as an example, for a security professional to be able to give back to a developer, they have to be able to deal with things in more real time. And the CI/CD pipeline is not going to just stop. So as an example, if you have something that's actually integrated into your code when it runs through the CI/CD pipeline, that's a way more successful approach. But the security curation that comes as part of all these tools that have tons of false positives, and in many cases also false negatives, there's not enough time between the time that you actually build your platform, build your application, deploy it, to be able to have somebody really go through and curate to figure out what the exploitability of that attack surface is. And I think the reason why we need to develop a metric in the industry is primarily because it's going to give our folks that are trying to do DevSecOps products an ability to have sort of that ideal state and a way for them to build their products to make it more successful at trying to measure something that's common. So we're trying to put our eggs in the securability basket because that draws in every scanner. It draws in early products that are helping you do things like code graphing early on. It's helping you to figure out how to pull in the threat modelers of the world. And I think, that ubiquitous measurement capability is what's been missing for commoditizing DevSecOps products. There's a lot of capabilities, to your point earlier, about all of the logos that are out there. Thousands of logos, many of which are claiming DevSecOps, but don't necessarily have the storyline for how that comes together. Or more importantly, who is the ultimate customer and what is the interface they want? Some of these products have fantastic capabilities, but they're still building old style UIs, old style risk interfaces, and they're basically dampening the likelihood understanding of what is security at this point. I would even argue that companies have been using impact times likelihood equals risk for a really long time. And I'm just going to be a little more controversial because likelihood was always really hard for companies to measure because there wasn't a lot of capability in the marketplace to help them understand what's coming at them. But that's really changing at this time. And I would say that the companies that are struggling a little bit with security are likely still using that old equation. And that actually causes a dampening effect on likelihood, meaning that when they multiply what they think the importance of a defect is against the actual likelihood of it happening, they actually put themselves behind adversaries because adversaries don't have to think about those things. And so I would just argue that what we've come up with is way more about resilience with the understanding that it's most likely to happen. And when you run all the calculations and measurements, it actually then gives you an advantage over the adversaries. So I just think we really have to change our measurement to draw out better products in the DevSecOps community and better ways of operating as industry.
I really
I
like what
think
you said there. Oh, go ahead, John.
there's this one real clarification on because she said something really sort of important. And I think I've said on here a different way before when I talk about just the vast amount of data which you end up getting when you have, every time you're doing a build, you're doing every time you do a check-in, you do a build, you do another scan, you've got yet more data to try and deal with, and good luck. But I think the way Shannon just described that is an important part, especially as you start to grow in size of your organization, is some way to either do some of that. I'll use modeling, but there's different ways you can say it. Do some of that earlier in the process, but also more importantly, how do you get some sort of automated analysis, not just around the scan, but the results of the scan. And I think
Yeah,
that
the security person now has a place in that process of, instead of giving away the scanner output or the security tool output to somebody who may not be able to read it, we're in the best position to read that information and render an opinion about it, and render an opinion that actually matters to the resilience of that application. And so I think security curation is a really big deal.
So I was going to say too, one of the things I liked about what you're talking about there about risk and likelihood, I'm a fan of aligning along risk, but likelihood is always that tough one to deal with because it's like, are you actually talking about frequency? Are we talking about like a velocity to likelihood, meaning this is an attack that could be pulled off in hours versus days versus weeks, or this is one that we've seen once a year or once a month, or even what is this likelihood based on? Meaning that a lot of times it kind of hand waves who the actual threat actor is in that equation. Um, but one of the ways to look at risk is that you can also see risk perhaps increases over time as tech becomes more legacy, perhaps as more vulnerabilities are discovered. How does that look like from a securability perspective and resilience? For example,
Yeah.
this is a bit of a leading comment, but I'm going to imagine just going from running 2 scanners to 3 scanners against your system isn't really increasing securability, that there's actually other factors that are more important at play here.
Yeah, that's right. And if you run more scanners, you may get dimensionally a little bit more information from them, because you do have a lot of companies now that are investing in researchers in their scanners because the CVEs are starting to drop off. And we're starting to see more investment in the research side as a result, because they know otherwise their scanners are not necessarily going to have the latest and greatest information about what's getting broken into. I think it's really important when we talk about likelihood to understand that the ultimate folks that really need all this information are the developers, are the makers, are the people who are building resilience into their applications. And without thinking about that, we actually start to lose all of the things that are important about this measure. So, from my perspective and from the people I'm working with on this, um, I think that the real way that you have to deal with likelihood is you have to be able to assert, is this 1 out of 100 times, 1 out of 10,000 times? Would you have a better chance of being hit by lightning? Is this a billion, 1 in a billion chance that this thing could happen? And by putting that into perspective, developers can understand, oh, I just got a library that has a vulnerability in it that's a 1 out of 10. And I don't necessarily know that I have to put all my emphasis on that, so long as the one is really right. But what about something that is 10 out of 10, right? It's the worst vulnerability on the market, and there's actually weapons out there that are being used. Shouldn't the developer have access to the threat intel that tells them that their application is being targeted? Shouldn't they have an understanding of whether or not the risk that they just took is 1 in a million? And aren't they in the best position to make the impact choice? Why would we actually take all of that out of their process and out of their hands and their ability to make those decisions? I think it's an essential part that the security teams out there are putting back understanding of what the likelihood is. And that's really the contribution that we have to be ready to make. And I think I'm actually saying it's a really high bar. I'm not saying that this is going to be easy for any of us, but it's the right thing to do. We have to understand adversaries. We have to understand everything that they're trying to do. And we've got to figure out how to make it pertinent to the people who are building.
Yeah, it sounds like I think that a lot of this idea of like resiliency, securability is really focusing on that impact, meaning that securability is a measure that is trying to increase, but the effect of that is that you're reducing the potential impact of these vulnerabilities, whether it's because you've sandboxed them, that you can deploy vulns faster, that you have done the shift left, you can find known vulns in your CI/CD pipeline easier. Is that a fair way of looking at this or thinking about this as you're trying to describe it and approach it?
Yeah, I think so. Really, it's about giving developers back something that they can actually tangibly understand. So five nines is how they live. And unless we as the security community are coming up with a five nines measure, they're never going to fully appreciate owning this in their applications and how they're building the software. So we've got to find a five nines measure that's going to do that. And I think that ultimately leads to more resilient, adversary resistant software because they're looking at their escapes, they're looking at their incidents, and they're determining what decision did I make that caused that to happen? What's the root cause analysis? And how am I going to get rid of it? Without five nines, they're not going to be able to be responsible or held responsible in companies. And I think that's why this is such a passionate plea to try and start adding a five nines measure. We think we have one. We're more than interested to work with anybody that is also working on a five nines measure for security. And I think, along the way, we're going to learn a lot as a community, but to get five nines is no small feat, especially when you start to realize that bad guys are just really getting much better. And they're also using machine learning and some new technology. Because from my perspective, that's going to cause us that if we aren't going to raise the bar now, it's going to get raised on us anyways. And I've always been a big, passionate advocate for making sure that software stays around for a really long time. I don't think that we can continue to have a low bar in security.
Well, I think it's also been no small feat that you've been able to talk with us for as long as you have, while your voice is possibly not quite meeting a five nines itself. Shannon, as you work on this, where's a good way to follow along on this work, or do you have some events coming up over the summer where we can find out more about this work you're doing?
Yeah, there's a white paper that's going to hit the streets next week. And I'm also presenting at Reinforce and have a couple of things coming up with IONS over the course of the next 6 months. I anticipate that the conversation needs to continue and even just get started. And so I'm really glad that you guys had me on because this is a very big deal to the community. And I'm glad to see it show up here.
Yeah, well, thanks again, and absolutely, we'll always be looking for that angle of metrics and how can we measure that the choices we're making, the time and money we're investing, are actually going in the right direction and having a positive impact. So, thanks again, Shannon. Thanks again, John. And we're going to take a quick break now, and we'll return with news of the week.